Thanks, Anthony. It was such a lovely and warm introduction, and you described my project far better than I have ever done myself. So I think at this point we can just all stop and eat the samosas and go. But I think it's fitting that my first official book talk is happening at the Center for South Asia at UW-Madison, because the center and the people associated with it that I see around the table here, too many of you, sustained me in ways which I'm so incredibly grateful for. And so much of what happens in this book, so much of what I write and discuss has been clarified in my conversations with all of you. And in a very true sense, I think more than my alma mater, this book is a product of UW-Madison and the Center for South Asia. So thank you for giving me a chance to be a part of this wonderful community that we have, and for giving me a chance to talk about my book for the first time, but all of you as well. Thank you, everyone. Right. First, I can't believe that I wrote a book and it got published. So it will take some time for that to subside, I guess. So if I'm a little shaky, please forgive me. The Disinherited, the politics of Christian conversion in India, has been germinating, I think, for a far too long time. I've always been someone who grew up in a very complex religious community, grew up in the jungle mahals in one of the most impoverished rural parts of India, where there were, other than the Hindu majority, a very significant Muslim minority, and an even more significant convert Christian, tribal, if you will, Adivasi population as well. I went to a Christian missionary school, as many Indian children do go, but somehow my upbringing left within me certain questions about my own place as an Indian citizen. And this book, I think I have been thinking about it forever, even if I've only researched and written about it in the last 10 years or so. I hope my graduate students are not scared by the fact that it takes that long. I promise it's an appropriate amount of time, not too long. My colleagues will tell you the same. I want to talk about this book, but it's fairly large. My editor made me cut out 40,000 words at the last pass, which tells you how long it was. And it will be impossible to talk about all the chapters, all the facets that I discuss here. So I'll take a small case study out of all the chapters. It's my favorite, because that is the way in which I found a foothold into the suspicions I had about conversion and religion and political identity in India. And some of those were substantiated by the research I did for this chapter. So at the very first go, let me just tell you that this is going to be one case study in depth. And I'll try and draw out what I make of this particular subject in terms of the entire book from that one case study. This will be the components of the talk, so to speak. I'll talk about India and Christian evangelism to an extent. I'll talk about that case study, and for that case study, we need to talk about inheritance in a legal sense, and how inheritance in a legal sense in India is essentially in the part of India that I'm talking about, Bengal, is predicated on one text, a religious text, which was seen as the component of personal law as it adhered to Hindus of Bengal, and this is Jimmy Bahana's Dayabhaga. I'll talk about the ways in which British imperial reformism essentially came into contact with this older textual understanding of how Hindu inheritance should act out. And that culminated finally in the so-called Lex Loci Act of 1850. I'll talk about the ways in which the Lex Loci Act promised certain freedoms, certain places of security for India's convert population, Christian convert population in terms of inheritance. And then I'll talk about how all those promises were rendered null and void when this was challenged by one of the major figures that I talk about in this particular case study, a man called Prashant Kumar Tagore, who disinherited his only son because that son had converted to Christianity. Finally, we'll talk, I think, a little bit about how the religious and the legal come together to create a negative space for Christian converts in India. that Christian converts suddenly find that their identity forevermore is tied with the failed negotiation with their religion of birth, and that their religion of choice can only bring about what I call an inheritance of loss. And then, to the relief of everybody in the room, we'll come to the conclusion. The very beginning, this is a question I have had to feel from everybody. From the moment I started writing my project, my advisor, my friends at Harvard, later on my colleagues here, and then my editor, everyone kept asking, why Bengal? Bengal has been so overdone in the history of India. There is nothing left to talk about apparently anymore. Why would you choose Bengal as the place that you would like to start your work on? And the answer to that is it's impossible to write a history of colonial India without essentially predicating the presence of Bengal in that story in some way, shape, or form. This is the big, British bridgehead. This is where British power solidifies itself. Calcutta remains the capital of the British until 1911. And as such, the corridors of power, political, social, and legal, are very strongly and firmly entrenched in Calcutta, which has a bearing on the rest of the country in some manner. That is something we need to keep in mind out for. The other thing about Bengal, of course, is many people tend to forget that there are smaller pockets of other colonial powers who exist within this particular space much later even than the actual independence of India from British imperial rule. So there are many different ways in which multiple denominations of Christian communities essentially find their space here. And before 1813, when the renewal of the Charter of the East India Company legally for the very first time allows the presence of Christian missionaries in British domains, even British Christian missionaries actually find their place not within the actual British domains, but in the smaller conclaves, Chandanagar, for example, which is a French conclave, Seranpur, which the Baptist missionaries essentially make their home, which is a Danish conclave. And therefore, Bengal has a very rich, and I think in some ways an underexplored history, which I thought I needed to highlight in my work here as well. So it's not all as cut and dried as it is made out to be. And the third thing, of course, is Christianity has such an outsized effect in Bengal, even in terms of the much discussed Bengal Renaissance. But in terms of the actual research, I think the last important book that came out is about 40 years old at that time. So there are multiple reasons as to why I decided and then stubbornly adhered to the fact that I was going to work on Bengal and why I thought that Bengal could represent what was happening in the wider Indian territories as well. In 1813, there is the renewal of the Charter of the East India Company. And this year is important because this is a moment in which most financiers of the City of London decide to push a bill to ask for a removal of the monopoly of the East India Company in Indian trade. This is a move to free up the space of India for everybody to take part in free trade. The thing that is forgotten often is that many of these financiers, including the directors of the Bank of England, are very strongly evangelical in their faith. And it is with their support that the abolitionist William Wilberforce, at the very end of the parliamentary discussion on the renewal of the charter, pushes through something called the Pious Clause, which allows, as I said, legally, the presence of missionaries within British territories in India for the first time. Does this mean that the British missionaries had not been present in India before this date? That's not true. There were British missionaries, British Protestant missionaries, even in Bengal, from around 1780s onwards. But this is a moment in which they get legal status for their presence and legal sanction for their activities as missionaries in Bengal. This, therefore, is also the moment in which there's a particular kind of discourse that starts emerging in the Bengali public sphere, which is also the Indian public sphere to all extents and purposes at this moment, about the legality of evangelism and the political benefits or otherwise of evangelism within the Indian communities. There is a strong feeling among older company servants and civilians that interference in the religious rights of Indian subjects would not lead to anything but rebellion. But there is a new kind of sensibility that starts growing up at this particular moment, which says, well, it is our duty to rule India, but it is also our duties in some way to bring about a progress in the manners and morals of Indian citizens. We have a duty towards saving the souls of Indians as well. The very presence of the missionaries, therefore, opens up a space of tension about religion, about evangelism, and about conversion programs. And you can see that reflected, if you will, in one of the most popular books that came out in 1812, 1813. It's a book by Thomas Rawlinson, who was a British civilian, who wrote it about his experiences in Bengal. It's called Very Tellingly Hoi Hai. You know, British servants were not taught to speak in anything but the imperative at the Fort William College. Hoi Hai is essentially just a random general call for Indian subjects to come and pay attention to their British masters. But in the kind of illustrations that you see here, it's very clearly demarcated between those of Indian faiths, Hindus, Muslims, so on and so forth, and those Christian denominations which are seen as foreign, coming in, settling in with this new rise in stability in British power. That kind of conflict, very clearly shown here. And of course, the purposes of bringing in Christianity, intolerance, bigotry, injustice, all of that has to be removed. But they are also saying something. What they are saying is a little silenced. What I try to do in my research then is think about both these sides, but try and privilege a little more as to what the resistance from Indians themselves might have been in terms of this sort of project of evangelism, Christian conversion in India. And in doing so, I think one of the theoretical interventions that I make in my book is on the concept of apologetics. There was a very famous essay with which I have a lot of disagreements, written by Faisal Devji about 20 years ago, I think, which talked about the fact that India had a partial and what he called a luxurious, in its older term of lecherous, if you will, modernity. And I think that apologetic in this sense is perhaps a misreading, or at least the way in which Faisal Devji does it is a misreading to me. Apologetics needed to be taken back to its original form, which is a rationed, positive affirmation, if you will, in a debate about the merits of one's own faith. And that is what I see happening over and over and over again in the kind of conversations, not merely in the public sphere, not merely through the print medium, which is becoming more and more widespread in this period, but also in every other field that is intimately tied to the life and to the intimacies that colonialism brought in India. So we find it in the social sphere, certainly, but we also find it in the political sphere, we find it in the legal sphere. And today I think I'll talk a little bit about the legal and the social together. Did Christianity and Christian conversions at all matter in Bengal? Another question that I have heard many times. If you look at any of the district gazetteers, for example, the number of Christians essentially sort of remains stable, anywhere between 1.5 to 2%, and that number has remained stable for the last 200 years, right? That is not a very significant part of India's population. That is certainly not a very significant part of Bengal's population either. So why should we talk about this community, this constituency? I argue that it's not the numbers, but the outsized anxiety that Christian conversion, or at least the threat of it, that engendered in the public sphere a kind of coherence or a building of a monolithic identity as a kind of defense from India's majority faiths. In Bengal, it's very clear that in the urban sphere, it's the Hindu Muslims, Bengalis, and in the rural sphere, it's the Muslims who are essentially trying and figuring out what it means to be a good Hindu and a good Muslim. And as much as we like to talk about the Hindu-Muslim binary in India, especially after 1857, about which there is a very significant scholarship, that part where both Hindus and Muslims before 1857 essentially are trying to figure out their identities, in contrast with Christianity and with Christian converts, remains a little bit unknown. Why do I say this? Because this is everywhere in the literature if we pay attention to it. Even someone like Kaliprashanna Singho, who is here in the picture, as you can see, what he is holding is his Bengali translation of the Mahabharata. That is what he is very well known for, a very orthodox aristocrat from Calcutta. But to Bengalis like us, of course, is also very well known for having written a satirical piece called The Hooting Owl or Hutom Pachar Naksha, where he talks about all the controversies, all the yellow journalism, if you will, that is taking place in Calcutta roughly between the periods of 1830 and 1860. The conversations, about the Hooting Owl's observations of Calcutta, it's published in 1861 and then again another edition in 1863. What does he say? This highly learned man, very liberal in his bequests, someone who was intimately involved in the Bengal Renaissance, but also someone who had a very strong opinion about what he saw as the terrible effects of Christianity, conversion, evangelical programs happening in Bengal. He talks about the fact that conversion to Christianity was a fashion. All young people have moments where you carry out, one of those TikTok, what is it? Challenges, right? So conversion to Christianity is like a TikTok challenge that you have to carry out if you want to be cool. At least that is his opinion here, if you will. And he brings up one particular person, the son of a man, Prasanna Kumar Thakur, who went outside the fort. And it's just astonishing, this is my translation, but the Bengali is even funnier. He talks about the fact that this is seen as a part of the Enlightenment that British civilization is bringing to India. And what is happening? It's sort of making holes in people's roofs, illuminating straight into their private domain. And then the result of all of this, of course, is that their parents are disinheriting them. They are taking the railways, another new fad, if you will, taking a journey on the railways going west. People are going away from their parents on these railways, and they're in such a poor state immediately afterwards because they have no support, either from their communities of birth, and also because they are racially disadvantaged, that they are left in a horrible, horrible state. He's very exercised about this. Thing is, he's talking about something that had happened about 11 years before the publication of his book, right? Why will he remember this? Obviously, even a singular high caste aristocratic conversion created an atmosphere of both fear and derision to a certain extent, which illuminated certain fears that the Hindus and Muslims had about the ways in which they were exerting control upon their younger members. That the surveillance within these communities of their younger members was obviously failing. And when these young people undertook the conversion challenge, if you will, they were leaving certain deep absences behind, one of which was the fact that they were no longer able to carry out any of the funerary rites or any of the rites of worship of the family idols, which essentially meant that not only were they destroying their own futures, and when I mean futures, I mean it in a cosmological sense here, they were destroying the cosmological futures of their parents as well. If they could not carry out any of the last rites of their parents or any of the worship of the family deities, it essentially meant that their poor parents, through no fault of theirs other than the fact that they could not control their children, were going to go to hell. So this is not merely a social problem, if you will. It is a question of whether or not someone merited going to heaven or not. And that's a much larger problem here than just the fact that certain men went out of the fort and converted, right? The person who's blamed for all of this and who's at the center of all of this, of course, is this particular man who came to India in 1830, He is Alexander Duff, missionary of the Scottish Free Church, educated at the University of Edinburgh. In his own memoirs of his about 33 years stay in India, this is what 33 years of living in India does to a human being. He says that he wanted to convert the entirety of India in a year. He doesn't even manage to convert the entirety of Calcutta, where he lands up within that year. But it is the intention that matters with God, I presume, and not with what you actually do. But he is at the center of a lot of these debates because he finds out another way in which an incursion into the private domains of Hindu Orthodox families could be mapped out. And there he essentially brings into place certain other anxieties about this new colonial governance, which is learning the English language so that young Bengali men could find good jobs, right? If you were a teacher and if you were in a school, in most cases, well, it's probably not true of any of you, but 200 years ago, maybe that was more of a case, where students had a great deal of love and devotion, and perhaps an undue degree of attachment to what their professors said. And that is where Alexander Duff essentially decided all his efforts at conversion would go. Was he successful? Seems like he was. At least 100, if not the entire city of Calcutta, or even that of India. And very soon, people start writing, we find evidence in the literature of the times about the horrible, heinous things he was doing in alienating school children away from the faith of their parents. This is poetry written by someone called Ishwar Gupta, largely forgotten today, only remembered as the earliest influence and mentor of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, the great novelist. And as you can see here, poems talking about the false missionary, about getting people to drown in the tub of love, all of which has this slight vision of something really improper happening, right? They never spell it out completely, but it's something unnatural. And whenever anyone uses the word unnatural in the English language, at least until the turn of the 20th century, you can be fairly sure that it's not going anywhere good, right? What is this tub of love? Of course, it's a baptismal font, and over again, this kind of poetry is being written, targeting Duff, that the boys have been snared. There's almost a predatory intent, if you will, in the work of the missionaries at the schools where parents are bound to send their children. They have no other option if they want their children to do well in this new British, government. And of course, as soon as they go there, there is the missionary lying in wait like a tiger to just snare those children's souls, right? This kind of intimacy, of course, again, starts getting vitiated with the suspicion about the intention of pedagogy in and of itself. And that also has had a very long shadow over what happens in India to this day. How many Bengali converts? Again, as I said, the numbers do not match the outsized panic that you can see reflected in whatever's happening on the ground. By 1852, they had managed a total of 107. Even if I sort of account for the fact that students in the schools, the numbers are pretty low, even if I account for that, 107 is not that much. But the source from which I get these numbers also does something very, very interesting, which is that it lays down the caste and religion of the boys being converted. And a significant number of these children come from high caste denominations, either Brahmins or Kayas, which also essentially is taken by Bengali society to be a reflection of the fact that missionaries were targeting those at the very top of society, those who decided the mores of a particular society, the ways in which that particular community should think of itself and behave. And that is why there were such large numbers of high caste converts. So again, even if the numbers are not large, the absolute panic is quite outsized. to this extent that there are multiple anti-Christian meetings in Calcutta. We have the minutes of the second meeting, which is held in 1847, under the auspices of the leader of the Orthodox Hindu Party in Calcutta, Radhakrishna Dev. And as you can see, there is a very, very strong kind of suggestion that children should be stopped from going to English medium schools, especially those run by missionaries. But of course, some crank said, well, if English did not lead to heaven, it certainly didn't do well, right? And that could not be discounted. So we also start getting a number of vyavasthas or diktats from learned pandits, Hindu scholars, who start thinking about what happens if a child actually makes the decision to convert. Was there any way for bringing them back into the fold? What could we do with them? This is one of those examples, right? If someone from the Hindu religion, essentially leaves that religion, becomes a Christian, what can we do for them? All the remedies are incredibly expensive, of course they are, and extremely elaborate. And we know, or at least I know from my investigation of all of this, that you would spend 100,000 rupees on this, and still you would not be accepted back by your extended families to any meaningful degree, right? So once you left the fold as a Hindu, coming back was almost impossible. And the missionaries become targets of assassination attempts. They are beat up. Alexander Duff himself is beat up. Here he is writing in one of his letters back home. The language he uses, the term he uses essentially is something that we have read recently in many different ways as well. Hindu khatre mein hai, they think is a very, very new term. Alexander Duff tells us, no, it's about 200 years old at this point. Hindus have always been in some sort of danger, and we have always defined ourselves and our religious practices in opposition to that perceived danger, right? The numbers tell us that the danger of Christianity was perhaps contained, but as you can see, it created a particular discourse against which Hindus started defining themselves. And this is happening at least 30 years before the events of 1857. This brings up to a related problem, which is that what happens when someone actually converts? From the very beginning, missionaries like Alexander Duff find out that one of the major impediments to people converting was that under Hindu and Islamic law, as it was understood customarily, they would not receive any kind of inheritance, either ancestral or patrimonial, either coming down from their ancestors or that one that was essentially what was gained by their fathers. Because, and this is what Gauri Vishwanathan actually described in great detail in her fantastic book, pioneering book, which is what, 25 years old at this point, Outside the Fold, where she talked about the very act of conversion as an act of deracination of spiritual death. Dead people do not inherit. Anyone who converted was actually spiritually dead, their soul was gone, and therefore they did not inherit. And for missionaries, this was one moment where they had to come together and find a way out so that people would not fear disinheritance and would actually convert with consent. This is where the Daibhaga comes into play. For the rest of India, it is Mitakshara, but for the Daibhaga, it essentially says that the Hindu father had the right to essentially alienate away property or give away property to anybody else than the son if they decided that the son had done something which excluded them from the family line, right? Meaning the father had the right essentially to do away with inheritance for the son, both ancestrally and patrimonially, and essentially give it, endow it to anybody else. What happens next is very, very interesting. Why does the Daibhaga say this? It says that a Hindu son needs to be able to carry out the last rites of a parent. That is what gives them the fitness to inherit. If someone essentially converts, they no longer have any right to carry out those last rites. And that essentially renders them unfit. And this is something that legal opinion in Bengal, in the Anglo-Indian juridical system, essentially is accepted completely. Dwarkanath Mitra, who is one of the earliest and first Indian origin judges on the Calcutta Supreme Court, and thereafter Lord Justice Wills, who is a member of the Privy Council, essentially says that it is being consanguineous, as in having a tie of blood, but even more than that, it is being able to carry out funerary rites, which is the basis of inheritance. If that is not done, then no inheritance can follow. A convert son, therefore, cannot have inheritance. As I said, if someone is already dead, they cannot carry out the funeral rites for another dead person, right? So that's there. What did the Lex Loci say? The Lex Loci said it doesn't matter whether or not they carry out funeral rites or the worship of family deities. Even if someone converted, they had the right to their parents' inheritance. This law is passed in 1850, but there are very early protests against this. And as we can already see here, there are petitions to the British Parliament where Lord Ellenborough, who was the ex-Governor General of India, talks about Christian converts as pseudo-converts. So it's not merely the Indian population which thinks of conversion as hollow, as being carried out not for the right reasons, as being carried out for material and racial benefits, but even within a very large section of the British aristocracy, those in power, there is an understanding that if Indians were becoming convert Christians, it was not the right thing to do, okay? And there, of course, we come to the question of that case study that I thought I was going to share with you, which I'll do very, very quickly. This is the signet ring of Prasanna Kumar Tagore. That is the signature. And there is his name in English outside. This was sold at Bonham's, the auction house, for about £29,000 in 2011, I think. How it went from here to there, as in here, as in India, to England, is another story altogether. But essentially, what happens is this particular man, who is counted as the chief legal expert in Bengal, who is a member of the legal committee that the Governor General's Council sets up to decide on the Indian Penal Code of 1860, essentially is also the foremost expert on the Daibhag. It's his son, remember, the hooting owl writing about Gyanendra Mohan Tagore, who actually converts, and he writes in his will that he had given enough to his son in his marriage as a bride gift, and therefore he was not going to inherit anything at all from his father's will. This man had, what happened? Sarah? If we do not have one technical problem, I don't think the talk is actually going. Anyway, this man had a property that was valued at, if you adjust for inflation, about three and a half million sterling pounds in this day and age. That's a huge property. And he essentially just disinherits his son, but his son is the first Indian origin barrister, and he institutes a legal case against his father's will, trying to gain back his properties because he thinks he has a clear case under the Lex Loci. All of this is documented in a letter that one family friend writes back home. He's in India, and he's like, this is better than a Jane Austen novel, so I have to write about it and send it home to my daughter, right? And this is in Manchester. And again, from what we hear or learn in this letter, of course, is that Prasanna Kumar disinherits his son, but gives it all to this man, who is his nephew, Jyotindra Mohan Tagore. And after Prasanna Kumar's death, of course, a legal battle ensues between his son and his cousin. That is the actual will of Prasanna Kumar Tagore. It says, I have already made such gifts, whatever, to my son, and he will inherit nothing whatsoever under this my will. The problem then, of course, is is Prasanna Kumar's will correct in its intention? Could such a gift be made to a nephew passing over a son? Or would the lex loci actually stand still, right? Prasanna Kumar, of course, also has done something very interesting even before he writes the will. He has a table of succession where he lays out, according to the Daibhag, if a son is alienated from the property, who should get the property next? It should be the brothers of the man whose son has been alienated. If the brothers are dead, it goes to the nephews. That is a brother's sons, right? The problem here, of course, is if someone is a legal expert and is counted as the foremost legal expert and has friends everywhere within the Anglo-Indian judicial system, and it is his will under contention, and that will essentially goes against an Anglo-Indian law, what do you do? This is a completely anomalous situation, right? For the British judges, the only way in which to understand the Daibhag was to depend on Prasanna Kumar's understanding of the Daibhag. What did Prasanna Kumar do? He circumvented the provisions of the lex loci. This is a table of succession. You can find it on Google Books. I paid for it and then it was made free, so I'm a little bitter about it. This is what brings about the Great Tagore Bill case, which goes on for almost 14 years, first at the Calcutta High Court and then in the Privy Council in London. And what it essentially does is hinge upon that idea of deracination. Whether or not the lex loci stood, it was the negative identity of the Hindu son, that they had failed at being a good Hindu son by converting, that decided that Prasanna Kumar's will remained true in substance, right? Whether or not anyone was a Christian, it was more important whether he was a Hindu or a Muslim before that. Any inheritance right actually accrued to that first religious identity and not to the religious identity of choice. And he loses everything. Gyanendra Mohan loses everything, takes his wife and children, goes off to England, and is incredibly bitter about it. Dies a very, very lonely death. At his death, 1890, he's still writing his will and making provisions that someone should fight Jyotindra Mohan Tagore about the provisions of his father's will so that his surviving daughters can inherit something. They don't, because Prasanna Kumar, that is Jyotindra Mohan, dies at least 20 years after Gyanendra Mohan dies. So just by the fact of being healthy and outliving his cousin and his cousin's children, he essentially keeps control of all the properties. What does the Caste Disabilities Removal Act do? These are the two acts. One is in 1850, one is in 1928. There you can see that no one should be disinherited on account of their conversion. Here you see anyone who is governed by the Daibhag does not fall within the ambit of that particular Lex Loci Act. So the Lex Loci, in effect, is defanged almost immediately. What does this case also do? It brings us to the identity of the Christian convert, which is in some nebulous space between the religious and the legal, which is to say that it's always a negative identity. And that is what has remained in the political discourse in India. It's not important that someone is a Christian. It's always presaged by the fact that, oh, at some point, someone in that family converted, and therefore they are all Hindus or all Muslims, and therefore they needed to be brought back into the fold. And that has become one of the ways in which a particular majoritarian violence is enacted against minority communities of faith in India. So whatever happened between a father and son in the 1850s and 60s essentially has ramifications for what happens between a citizen and his fatherland or motherland, whatever way you want to think about it. That it's the negative, suspicious identity that for India's minority citizens is so much more important than what their chosen faith might be. We find this again in 1857, when someone like Syed Ahmed Khan essentially lays it all out. It is because the British have supported this sort of missionary intervention that a huge revolution has taken place, right? We even find it in someone as liberal and Catholic, if you will, in his opinions, like Rabindranath Tagore. Gyanendra Mohan Tagore was his father's cousin. that part of the family was Orthodox Hindu, even though we know that this part of the family was Brahmo. And he writes about the fact that conversion does not take away ethnic or communitarian identity. Even if someone converted to Christianity, they would be Hindu Christian, Hindu Muslim, whatever that might mean, the tiny hyphen, that is what contained the essence of the identity of a convert or someone from a minority community, right? And whatever way that hyphen was essentially interpreted is what is the right that is given to a minority citizen of faith in India. Aftermath. There is no space of security or safety for minority communities, especially Christians in India, even if the lex loci essentially lays it all out and says legally this can be done. As we have seen, the Tagore versus Tagore case essentially proves that religion comes first, religious identity comes first, majoritarian religious identity comes first, and nothing else mattered, even in the domain of Anglo-Indian law. It was Indian opinion rather than British reformism which triumphed in this case. Finally, what do we make of all of this? Why the disinherited? Christians have been called disinherited by a number of intellectuals in the 20th century. Howard Thurman's very influential and poignant book, for example, The Disinherited of the Earth. The historian Will Durant talked about the fact that Christian religion gives certain kind of dignity to those who are minoritized, those who are the most liminal of people on earth, right? Even calls it the first communist religion, whatever that might mean, communist and religion together. What I see in my research, of course, is that it does nothing of the sort in India. Even if there is a hope behind conversion, that there is going to be a material betterment of their situation, politically, socially, legally, over and over and over, I find in my research that all that is done is make them more liminal, subject them to a rhetoric of suspicion, where anyone who's a minority citizen is inextricably tied to a supposed earlier authentic religious identity. And it is this negative identity, which is more important in the political discourse than what they choose to do as in their most, what shall I say, devoted private faith, right? And what does it do to India's minorities then, when they have to prove over and over and over again that they are Indians first, and whatever the religious identity is comes next? As a Hindu, I never have to do that. I don't have to ever prove that I'm Indian before I'm Hindu. For everyone else in India, I don't think that's the same. It has meant essentially a disinheritance in real time. The space where minorities of India exist in real time have become more and more constricted, more and more airless, which has essentially led to, I think, within the last year, more than 800 attacks on Indian churches of the most violent kind, none of which, of course, has been addressed by the Indian government, but the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom has documented the past few years or so. So whatever happened 200 years ago obviously has ramifications today. That is why the book is named The Disinherited. Thank you, everyone.